The final turn onto the private road was nothing more than a pair of muddy ruts swallowed by encroaching nettles. My old estate car, packed to the roof with tools and solvents and canvases, groaned in protest, its suspension bottoming out more than once. The journey had been long, a blur of gray motorways and dwindling country lanes, but the true isolation only began here, a sudden, suffocating quiet. I preferred it this way, of course. My work demanded precision, patience, and an unbroken focus that most cityscapes simply couldn't provide. Solitude was not a burden, it was a workshop, but this was different. This wasn't the familiar hum of my own quiet studio. This was something vast, ancient, and profoundly still. The manor emerged from the dense tangle of overgrown woodland like a forgotten sentinel. It wasn't a house. It was a statement of monumental, decaying grandeur. The gray stone, once perhaps a proud, bright edifice, was now stained with centuries of rain and grime, patched with lichen that clung like a second, fungal skin. Gaping holes where windows should have been stared out like empty eye sockets, and the roofline sagged in places, a broken spine. A chill, despite the late afternoon sun, threaded its way through the car's vents. The solicitor, a brisk woman with an unsettlingly cheerful disposition, had called it a unique opportunity. I'd called it a monumental undertaking. My inheritance, she'd explained. A distant relative I barely remembered. A man whose existence had been reduced to a single, faded photograph in my grandmother's album. He had died, alone in this place, leaving me everything. The everything mostly consisted of this crumbling structure and its sprawling, wild grounds. I pulled the car to a halt before what might once have been an imposing iron gate, now rusted off its hinges and lying half-buried in a mound of brambles. The gravel drive beyond was long gone, reclaimed by weeds and moss, winding its way towards the manor's front entrance, which was obscured by the skeletal branches of some ancient, sprawling tree. Stepping out, the air was immediately colder, heavier. It smelled of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something else, a faint metallic tang that I couldn't quite place. The silence was absolute, unbroken by birdsong or the distant drone of traffic. My boots crunched on fallen twigs and brittle leaves as I began the slow walk towards the house. I reached the massive oak front door, which was warped and weathered, its once grand carvings almost entirely obscured by grime. A heavy, ornate knocker, shaped like a grimacing gargoyle, was coated in a thick layer of green verdigris. I didn't bother with it. The solicitor had given me a single, heavy brass key, its teeth intricate and worn. The lock groaned, protesting its long slumber, but eventually yielded with a resounding clunk that echoed strangely in the profound stillness. I pushed the door inward. It moved with agonizing slowness, scraping against the floorboards, releasing a puff of stagnant, dust-laden air. The smell inside was worse than outside, a cloying mixture of mildew, dry rot, and something else, something vaguely sweet, yet sickening. The grand entrance hall was a cavern of gloom. Dust motes danced in the few weak shafts of light that pierced the grimy windows, looking like tiny, lost galaxies. Sheets draped over unseen furniture created spectral forms, a silent congregation of ghosts. It felt less like an empty house and more like a vast, decaying organism. I pulled a powerful LED torch from my bag, its beam cutting a stark path through the gloom. As I moved closer, the beam picked out something peculiar. Not a repair, I realized, but a section of brick that seemed to recede slightly, a subtle indentation. My fingers, usually so precise and careful in their work, traced the rough surface. It wasn't just recessed. A thin, almost invisible seam ran around its perimeter, perfectly rectangular, about a foot wide and 2 feet tall. A concealed door, a forgotten cupboard. My professional curiosity, a familiar anchor in my often solitary existence, flared to life, momentarily overriding the creeping unease. I pressed gently on the brickwork. It didn't budge. I ran my hand over the surface again, slower this time, searching for a latch, a hidden catch. My fingers brushed against a small, almost imperceptible protrusion near the bottom right corner, not a button, but a tiny, raised point of stone, barely larger than a pebble, worked into the mortar itself. It felt oddly smooth, almost polished, amidst the rough brick. I pressed it. Nothing happened, or at least nothing obvious. The wall remained inert, but as I pulled my hand back, a faint, almost imperceptible click seemed to echo from deep within the stone, a sound so soft it could have been the settling of the old house, or perhaps only my own straining imagination. I stood there, torch beam fixed on the unyielding brick, a determined restorer facing a new challenge, but also a solitary man who had just announced his presence to something ancient and unknowable that had long resided in the depths of this place. Orway signs and service station coffee. But now the manor loomed, a silhouette against the bruised evening sky, its gables like crooked teeth, its windows like vacant eyes. I cut the engine, and the sudden silence was profound, heavy, pressing in from the overgrown wilderness. The air, thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, seeped through the cracked window seals. My breath hitched, a knot tightening in my gut. This wasn't just a house. It was a monument to forgetting. I climbed out, the gravel crunching under my boots, a sound swallowed instantly by the vast quiet. The front door, a monstrous slab of oak, was ajar, a sliver of deeper blackness visible within. It felt less like an invitation and more like a sigh exhaled across centuries. The first week was a blur of unpacking and initial assessments. Dust motes danced in the sparse shafts of light that pierced the grimy windows, illuminating a landscape of shrouded furniture and skeletal cobwebs. The air inside was cold, stagnant, carrying faint, unidentifiable odors, something metallic, something like old paper, and an underlying sweetness that was almost sickly. I chose the library as my first project. It was a cavernous room, lined floor to ceiling with forgotten tomes, their spines cracked and faded. The sheer volume of material, the potential for discovery, drew me in. I envisioned the dark wood gleaming again, the leather bindings supple, the silence filled with the quiet rustle of turning pages. My days settled into a rhythm, early mornings with coffee, then hours spent meticulously cataloging, cleaning, and repairing. I began with a section of shelves near the grand, arched window, carefully brushing away layers of grime from the carved pilasters, examining each book for signs of insect damage or water ingress. My tools: a soft bristled brush, a tiny vacuum, a selection of leather conditioners and glues lay arranged on a drop cloth spread over a heavy oak table. I was a creature of habit, of precision. Every tool had its place. That's why the first deviation snagged at me. I'd set my smallest bristle brush, the one for delicate gold leaf, beside a stack of particularly fragile folios. When I reached for it, it wasn't there. I scanned the table, then the floor. Nothing. A flicker of irritation. I must have misplaced it. I found it minutes later, tucked inside a large, leather-bound dictionary on a lower shelf, a shelf I hadn't touched all morning. My brow furrowed. I clearly remembered placing it on the table. My memory wasn't failing me. Not yet. I dismissed it as fatigue, a momentary lapse. The next day, it was my sanding block. I'd been working on a small, intricately carved wooden box I'd found tucked away behind some books, preparing it for a new finish. I'd stepped out for a moment, just to rinse my hands in the rudimentary kitchen sink. When I returned, the block which I'd left on the workbench was gone. I searched, my patience fraying. I found it later, balanced precariously on the very top of a towering stack of volumes, almost touching the ceiling. It was impossible for me to have put it there, or for it to have simply fallen upwards. A shiver traced its way down my spine. The house was playing tricks, or I was. The sound started subtly. The soft creak of a floorboard directly above me, when I knew the upper floors were empty and locked. I started to feel a prickle on the back of my neck, the distinct sensation of being observed. One afternoon, as I was carefully cleaning the spine of a particularly ancient, vellum-bound manuscript, a sharp, resounding thump echoed through the room. I flinched, my hand nearly slipping. I looked up, my heart racing. A heavy, leather-bound volume, one of the largest in the collection, lay open on the floor directly in front of me. It had fallen from a shelf nearly 10 feet high, a shelf I hadn't disturbed. The book was old, its pages yellowed, and it lay open to a specific page, as if deliberately. My hands trembled as I knelt, my fingers brushing the aged paper. The page was covered in spidery, faded script, not Latin as I'd expected from its appearance, but an archaic form of English. The handwriting was frantic, almost clawed into the page. I squinted, deciphering the words. The house demands its due. Not coin, not blood, but the threads of self. This wasn't just old paper, it was a warning. The sensation of being watched intensified, a palpable weight. My solitude, once a comfort, now felt like a trap. The silence was no longer empty, it was waiting. Then a sudden, brutal shift. The library walls dissolved, the scent of old paper replaced by the metallic tang of disinfectant and something else, something cloying and sickly sweet. I was no longer kneeling on the dusty library floor. I was slumped in a hard, plastic chair, my wrists chafed, a dull ache throbbing in my head. Prison hospital ward at midnight. The words, unbidden, formed in my mind, a terrifying certainty. A low, guttural moan escaped my lips, not from me but from somewhere close, somewhere inside the memory. Then just as abruptly the white walls wavered, the harsh light receded, and the familiar, musty scent of the library rushed back in. I gasped, sucking in the stale air, my body shaking. I was still on the floor, the ancient book still open before me, its cryptic message staring up. What was that? A memory? A premonition? Or was the house already showing me what it intended to take? My mind, once a fortress of meticulous order, felt suddenly permeable, vulnerable. The house didn't just want to be restored, it wanted to be remembered, and in doing so it was beginning to unravel me. A sharp, metallic tang filled my nostrils, followed by the cloying scent of antiseptic. The hum of fluorescent lights, cold and sterile, pressed down on me. I saw peeling paint on institutional green walls, a narrow cot, a barred window. Outside, a sliver of moon, high and indifferent. It was the prison hospital ward at midnight, and I was there, or I had been. The image flickered, a shard of ice in my mind, then dissolved, leaving behind a cold sweat and a profound sense of disorientation. My eyes snapped open, or perhaps they merely refocused. The silence was profound, heavy, a tangible thing that seemed to absorb all sound, all thought. I was back in the truck, still parked before the looming silhouette of the house, the engine cut just as it had been moments or perhaps hours before. The bruised evening sky had deepened to an inky black, dotted with indifferent stars. Had I fallen asleep? The thought felt inadequate, flimsy. That vision so vivid, so jarring. It felt like a memory, yet it made no sense. Stress. That was it. Days of driving, weeks of planning, and now this overwhelming, decaying structure. The next morning, the sun was a watery smear behind low clouds, doing little to dispel the gloom within the manor's walls. I chose the study first, not the grand library with its collapsing shelves, but a smaller, more intimate room tucked away at the back of the house, overlooking a choked, forgotten garden. It felt less overwhelming, a place I could make my own. My own, at least, until the full restoration began. Dust motes danced in the weak shafts of light that pierced the grimy windows, illuminating the ghosts of countless forgotten moments. As an antique restorer, I saw not decay but potential. Every crack, every faded patch told a story. I started with a section near the fireplace, where the wood paneling seemed to bulge slightly, almost imperceptibly. My fingers, calloused from years of delicate work, traced the lines of the wood, searching for seams, for anomalies. I worked methodically, using my small toolkit, a slender pry bar, a set of chisels, a soft bristled brush. The rhythmic scrape and tap were the only sounds in the vast, silent house, an almost meditative counterpoint to the growing tension in my shoulders. Beneath a particularly stubborn section, where the grain seemed to twist unnaturally, I felt a slight give. Not rot, but a deliberate cut, expertly concealed. My breath hitched. Years of experience told me this wasn't just poor craftsmanship. This was a secret carefully guarded. With careful precision, I worked the pry bar into the seam. The wood groaned, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of the house. A section of the paneling, about 2 feet square, swung inward on unseen hinges, revealing a cavity. The air that rushed out was stale, heavy, carrying a distinct aroma of dry earth and old paper, tinged with that same metallic sweetness. Inside, nestled on a shelf carved crudely from the rough-hewn rock, was a single object, a leather-bound journal. No dust had settled on it, as if it had only just been placed there. My fingers trembled slightly as I pulled it out. The leather was supple, well-preserved despite its apparent age. The pages, however, were brittle, yellowed, and covered in a spidery, almost illegible script. The entries weren't dated chronologically, but seemed to jump, fragments of thought rather than a coherent narrative. One passage, written in a bolder, almost frantic hand, caught my eye. The memory fails like a moth to flame, drawn to the truth of what was but devoured by the lie of what is. He feeds, he waits. The knowing is the forgetting, the self unravels. The harvest moon brought the first missing, as it always does. They called it the Black Blight. It began with forgetting, a slow erosion of what made them whole. Even the constable, a man of iron, forgot his own daughter's face. I frowned, rereading the words. The knowing is the forgetting, the self unravels. What did that even mean? It sounded like the ramblings of a fevered mind, a descent into madness. Yet an icy tendril of unease coiled in my gut. The mention of the old mill and the Black Blight sounded like local legends, grim and unsettling. I felt a sudden, profound sense of disorientation. For a moment, I couldn't recall why I was holding the journal, or even what room I was in. My mind felt like a sieve, thoughts slipping through. Read, I read tired, I told myself, my voice a whisper in the echoing room. Stress, isolation, this old house is getting to I. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog. I looked down at the journal in my hands, then back at the exposed cavity. Had I put the tools away? I couldn't remember. I glanced at my workbench, seeing the chisels and pry bar neatly arranged, just as I'd left them before starting work. But I distinctly remembered just using them, placing them down only moments before finding the cavity. My mind, usually a well-ordered archive of facts and processes, felt fuzzy, like a faint static had begun to hum behind my eyes. I tried to recall what I'd had for breakfast. A bowl of oatmeal, I thought, or was it toast? The details were hazy, like a photograph slightly out of focus. It was unnerving, this sudden blankness. I always remembered. Meticulous, that was me. Every step, every detail filed away. I gripped the journal tighter, the unsettling words about the self unravels suddenly feeling too close for comfort. This was just fatigue, I reasoned. I needed to focus. I needed to restore. That was my purpose here. But as I tried to recall the specific steps for cleaning the ornate fireplace mantel, a crucial detail, a precise chemical mixture for the antique brass, eluded me. It was right there, on the tip of my mental tongue, but just beyond reach. The cold seeping into my fingers was the first thing I registered, a dull ache that resonated with the hollow space in my chest. I blinked, the faint glow of the desk lamp doing little to dispel the shadows that clung to the corners of the study. My memory of the previous night was a frayed tapestry, fragments of discovery, the thrill of the hidden cavity, then a sudden, jarring blank. I knew I'd handled the chisels, the pry bar, but seeing them neatly returned to the workbench, as if untouched, was a disconcerting puzzle. I ran a hand over my stubbled jaw, the rough texture grounding me, however, slightly. The faint scent of dust and old paper hung heavy, a constant companion in this house. This morning the confusion felt heavier, thicker, like a shroud. I'd gone to make coffee, only to find the pot already brewed, still warm. I didn't remember doing it. A small, insignificant detail, yet it pricked at me, a growing pinprick of unease. I spent the next few days immersed in the journal, its elegant script detailing mundane daily entries that gradually twisted into something else entirely. The writing grew erratic, the observations increasingly paranoid. My research began in earnest. The nearest town's small, dusty library held little, but an online archive of regional historical societies yielded a few unsettling mentions. I found fragmented newspaper clippings, scanned and faded, hinting at a pattern. The Manor, or Blackwood Manor as it was once known, had a reputation, not for ghosts but for its inhabitants. A succession of owners, all men of means and intellect, had met peculiar ends. One vanished without a trace in the late 1800s, leaving behind only a half-finished manuscript and a bewildered housekeeper. Another, a renowned cartographer, was found years later wandering the moors, his mind a shattered landscape, unable to recognize his own reflection, babbling about stolen memories. The accounts were sparse, vague, dismissed as local folklore or the isolated tragedies of isolated men. But the pattern, once I started connecting the dots, was stark. Each man, it seemed, had delved into the manor's secrets, and each had lost something vital in return. The entity's influence, subtle at first, sharpened its claws. Sleep became a battleground. Nightmares, vivid and visceral, began to plague me. I'd wake up gasping, drenched in sweat, the taste of ash in my mouth. One afternoon, while sifting through a box of old land deeds, a shimmering distortion flickered at the edge of my vision. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, a ripple in the air like heat haze on a summer road, but inside the manor's cool, still study. I rubbed my eyes, dismissing it as fatigue. But later, the scent of mildew and damp earth, a familiar smell of the house, was suddenly overlaid with something else, metallic and acrid like old blood and rust. I sniffed the air, searching, but it vanished, leaving only the usual mustiness. The memory gaps grew bolder. I found myself in the kitchen, a half-peeled potato in my hand, no recollection of why I was there or what I intended to cook. Once, I spent an entire hour searching for a specific historical text, only to find it open on my desk, the very page I needed highlighted. I had no memory of picking it up, let alone marking it. It was as if a part of my day, a piece of my consciousness, was being systematically excised. I tried to recall conversations, specific moments, and find only static, a blank wall where memories should have been. The previous owner, the one who wrote the journal, had begun his descent after unearthing a particular stone tablet, described in one article as an ancient, unidentifiable relic, found buried beneath the manor's oldest foundation stone. The journal then described a deepening connection and the slow, sweet erosion of the self. It wasn't just madness. It was a parasitic relationship, a gradual consumption of identity. What if the entity wasn't just driving people mad, but replacing them? My own reflection in the dusty glass of a picture frame seemed less familiar, the eyes too wide, too haunted. I was losing time, losing myself. Then one moment I was sitting at my desk, poring over another faded document, the words blurring before my eyes. The next, a stark, metallic tang filled my nostrils, sharper than anything I'd smelled before. The air was thick with the faint, medicinal reek of disinfectant and something else, something cloying and sickly sweet. My head swam. My eyes fluttered open. I was lying on a cot, a thin, scratchy blanket pulled up to my chin. The room was small, stark, painted a sickly pale green. The metallic clanging of distant doors echoed, followed by the muffled shouts of a guard. The air conditioning unit in the corner hummed with a low, mechanical thrum. A harsh, fluorescent light flickered intermittently from the ceiling, making everything jump and swim. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum against the sudden, overwhelming reality of my surroundings. I was in a prison hospital ward at midnight. How? Why? I pushed myself up, my limbs heavy, sluggish. My clothes were gone, replaced by a thin, rough-spun gown. My head throbbed, a dull ache behind my eyes. I looked down at my hands, rough and calloused from restoration work, and they felt alien, distant. I couldn't see it clearly, only its presence, a heavy, watching weight. My name, Reed, felt like a borrowed word, a label someone else had given me. I closed my eyes, trying to grasp onto something familiar, anything. The manor, the journal, the chisels on the workbench. But they felt like distant dreams, memories that belonged to another life, another self. I was here, but who was here? And where had Reed gone? The journal lay open before me, its brittle pages. Why, no, that wasn't right. My eyelids felt heavy, gritty, as if I hadn't truly slept in days. When I finally forced them open, the world didn't resolve into the familiar, comforting gloom of the Manor study. Instead, I was staring at a ceiling of acoustic tiles, stained with vague, yellowish rings. A single caged fluorescent fixture hummed overhead, casting a sickly, anemic light that did little to fight back the deep, bruised purple of the room's corners. The air tasted of antiseptic and something else, something metallic and faintly acrid, like stale sweat and fear. My head throbbed, a dull, insistent rhythm behind my eyes. I pushed myself up, my muscles protesting with a stiffness that spoke of prolonged inactivity. I was lying on a narrow cot, the mattress thin and unyielding. The sheets were rough, institutional white, and smelled faintly of bleach. This wasn't the Manor. It wasn't anywhere I knew. I swung my legs over the side of the cot, my bare feet landing on a linoleum floor that felt strangely gritty beneath my soles. My hands, when I looked at them, seemed paler, the knuckles more prominent. Where was I? How did I get here? My gaze swept around the sparse room. 4 identical cots, 3 of them empty, lined the walls. A small, bolted-down metal table and 2 chairs occupied the center. The only door was a heavy, windowless slab of steel, painted the same dull blue as the scrubs. A small, gridded vent near the ceiling exhaled a faint, recycled breeze. Beyond the door, I heard distant, muffled sounds. A low moan, a sudden, sharp clatter, the squeak of rubber soles on a hard floor. A prison. I was in a prison, but why? My mind scrambled, desperate for an anchor, a memory. It was all there but distant, like a dream I was struggling to recall. Or was that the dream? Reed. The voice was a dry rasp coming from the cot directly opposite mine. I flinched, spinning around. An old man, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his eyes milky and unfocused, was propped up on one elbow, staring at me. He had a thin, wispy beard and his scrubs hung loose on his emaciated frame. Who are I? I demanded, my voice hoarse, unfamiliar. He coughed, a wet, rattling sound. I don't remember, do I? They brought I in last night. This couldn't be happening. I was Reed, an antique restorer. I was restoring the Manor. I was reading a journal. This was a mistake. A nightmare. A sudden, sharp clang echoed from outside the door, followed by the heavy thud of a boot. My heart hammered against my ribs. I had to get out. I had to understand. What do you mean, like all the others? I pressed, stepping towards the old man. He turned his head slowly, his eyes fixing on me with an unnerving clarity for a moment. The ones who forget, the ones who lose their way, they all end up here in the ward. They say the same things over and over. Another empty vessel. The word struck me like a physical blow. Empty vessel. That was what it wanted, wasn't it? This was it. This was the entity, not a spectral figure, but a psychological assault, meticulously crafted to unravel me. A sudden dizzying wave washed over me. The sterile smell in the air intensified, taking on a cloying, metallic sweetness. The fluorescent hum seemed to vibrate directly inside my skull. Do I truly, or are I just the latest iteration? The newest face worn by a mind that has forgotten its own beginning? My breath hitched. The air grew heavy, thick with unseen pressure. Memories, sharp and vivid, flashed before my eyes. My childhood home, the smell of my mother's baking, the worn leather of my first toolbox, the satisfaction of a perfectly restored antique. The old man's face, still impossibly distorted, leaned closer, though he hadn't moved from his cot. I think I was an antique restorer, a quiet life, a noble pursuit. What if it was a cage? And what if my memories of a life before it are just stories told to keep I calm? My knees buckled. I gripped the edge of the metal table, my grip tight. No, my name is Reed. I lived in a small apartment before the Manor. That left I, empty. A searing pain lanced through my temple. A flash of orange light, the acrid smell of burning wood, a desperate, choking gasp. It wasn't a memory I recognized, not truly, but the sensation of it was overwhelming, terrifyingly real, or perhaps it could have. And the beautiful Manor, the meticulous restoration, the gentle decay. A soothing balm, isn't it? You are the echo of a forgotten name clinging to a borrowed life, and soon even that will fade. The sterile air of the ward warped, the hum of the fluorescent light escalating into a piercing shriek. The floor seemed to tilt, the walls to breathe. I squeezed my eyes shut, clutching my head, trying to block out the onslaught, hold onto the fragments of myself. My name, my work, the scent of linseed oil and polished wood. When I opened my eyes, the old man was gone, the other cots were empty. The walls were just walls, the acoustic tiles stained but still. The fluorescent light hummed, sickly and anemic as before. The metallic tang in the air was fainter. I was alone in the prison medical wing at midnight. My hands were shaking, my breath ragged. They was the old man real, I was Reed. I was. The sterile air of the prison hospital ward at midnight warped, the hum of the fluorescent light escalating into a piercing shriek. My name, my work, the scent of. What was it? Linseed oil and old wood. No, this was antiseptic and something metallic like blood and fear. I opened my eyes slowly, the world still shimmering at the edges. The white walls were too bright, the bed too narrow, the restraints on my wrists a cold, undeniable reality. Restraints. Why? My mind was a sieve, every thought slipping through the cracks before I could grasp it. There was a memory of the manor, of the deep, echoing silence of its halls, of dust motes dancing in sunlight that never quite reached the ground floor. That felt more real, more mine than this suffocating clinical box. A flicker of movement by the door. A shape, indistinct in my peripheral vision. My breath hitched. I pulled against the leather cuffs, a futile gesture that only chafed my skin. A low groan escaped my throat, a sound I barely recognized as my own. Hello, I tried, the word a rasp. Can anyone hear me? The shape solidified. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just watched me with eyes that held no discernible emotion. I need to leave, I stammered, the words suddenly feeling foolish. There's been a mistake, I'm Reed. I'm an antique restorer, I was at the manor, it needs me. The last sentence felt desperately important, a lifeline to a self I was losing. The guard remained silent, his gaze unwavering. It was like speaking to a statue or a phantom. My frustration spiked, sharp and hot. Don't I understand, the manor, it's not safe. There's something there, something that takes things, memories, identity. He took a slow step into the room, then another. His boots made no sound on the linoleum floor. It pressed down on me, smothering my nascent attempts at clarity. I need help. I need to call someone, my colleague. He'll vouch for me, he'll know. But even as I said it, the face of my colleague blurred, his name. I couldn't recall his name. A wave of nausea washed over me, the floor threatening to tilt again. This was it. This was the entity's work. It wasn't just the manor, it was here too. It had followed me, or perhaps it had sent me here. I thrashed against the restraints, a frantic, animalistic struggle. The leather bit into my wrists, hot tears stinging my eyes. Get me out, this isn't real, none of this is real. The guard advanced further, his hand reaching for something on the wall. A panel, he pressed a button. A faint, high-pitched whine filled the room, making my teeth ache. I have to get back, I pleaded, my voice cracking. It's feeding, it's taking me apart piece by piece, the clues. I saw them, the hidden rooms, the names carved into the wood. It's all connected. My mind raced, trying to pull disparate threads together, but they slipped through my fingers like water. The manor was a distant dream, this ward a waking nightmare. Suddenly, a different voice cut through the sterile air, calm and authoritative, though it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Reed, I am safe here. The voice was familiar, disturbingly so. It wasn't the guard speaking. The guard still stood, impassive, his hand still on the panel. Safe. I scoffed, a hysterical laugh bubbling up. Safe from what? From myself, from the truth. I stared at the guard, trying to find an ally, a flicker of humanity in his eyes. There was nothing. His gaze was like glass. My resolve solidified. I had to prove it wasn't real. I had to get out. I tugged with all my might, a desperate surge of adrenaline flooding my system. The bed shuddered. I ignored the burning in my wrists, the sharp ache in my shoulders. I twisted, pulled, kicked. I needed to reach the door, needed to tell someone, anyone, about the manor, about the thing that whispered in the dark. Reveal/discovery. As I strained, pushing against the confines of the bed, the wall directly opposite me began to ripple. Not like water, but like heat haze distorting a distant road. The white paint wavered, the sharp corners softened, then elongated, stretching impossibly. The hum of the fluorescent light deepened, became a resonant thrum, a vibration that resonated in my very bones. And then through the shimmering distortion I saw it. A glimpse of the ornate, peeling wallpaper of the Manor's master bedroom. The guard, still standing by the panel, seemed to waver too, his uniform blurring into the pattern of a faded tapestry. My struggle ceased. My breath caught in my throat. I squeezed my eyes shut, then opened them wide. The wall was white again, solid, unyielding. The guard was sharp, real, but the afterimage of the Manor, of the impossible glimpse, clung to my vision like a spiderweb. No escape, Reed. Not from here, not from me. The sterile air of the ward was no longer just sterile. It felt heavy, pregnant with an unseen presence. My attempts to escape weren't just futile. They were being actively, maliciously thwarted. And the most terrifying realization was that the walls of this prison hospital ward at midnight, and perhaps even the walls of my own mind, were no longer entirely my own. The sterile air of the prison hospital ward at midnight was no longer just sterile. It felt heavy, pregnant with an unseen presence, a thick, cloying dread that settled in my lungs. And the most terrifying realization was that the walls of this prison hospital ward at midnight, and perhaps my very own mind, were no longer distinct. My vision swam, a greasy film clinging to the edges of my perception. I lay on a narrow cot, the coarse fabric of the sheet scratching against my skin. The room was stark, lit by a single caged bulb in the ceiling, casting long, wavering shadows that danced like hungry specters. A low, continuous hum vibrated through the floorboards, a sound that seemed to originate not from machinery, but from the very air itself, a deep, resonant thrumming that rattled my teeth. The scent of antiseptic was overpowering, but beneath it, something else festered, a metallic tang like old blood and a faint, sweet decay like forgotten flowers. I tried to sit up, but my muscles protested, heavy and unresponsive. A dull ache throbbed behind my eyes, a constant pressure that made coherent thought a struggle. Yet through the fog, fragments began to surface, sharp and vivid like shards of broken glass. I saw the Manor not as I had found it, but as it once was. A grand, imposing structure, yes, but surrounded by a strange, almost imperceptible distortion in the air. The trees around it seemed to lean away, their branches gnarled and bare, even in summer. I remembered the old diary, the cryptic entries about the hunger and the offering. I had dismissed them as mad ramblings, the delusions of a tormented mind. The hum intensified, vibrating into my skull, and with it came images. They were performing a ritual, a desperate plea to something that dwelled beneath the soil, something that demanded tribute. Not gold, not livestock, but something far more precious. Memory. I felt a jolt, a sudden, sickening lurch, as if a piece of my own past had been forcibly excised. A childhood memory, insignificant, fleeting, the taste of my grandmother's lemon cake, the warmth of her hand simply vanished. I looked across the prison hospital ward at midnight. There were other cots, other figures lying still. One, a gaunt, elderly man, stared blankly at the ceiling. His eyes were wide, unblinking, yet utterly devoid of recognition. His face was a mask, his identity a forgotten dream. I watched as an attendant, a large, silent man in a crisp white uniform, moved slowly, checking on the inert forms. He didn't speak, didn't offer comfort. He simply observed, his gaze as empty as the old man's. Identity, the entity, I realized with a paralyzing clarity, wasn't just an inhabitant of the Manor. It was the Manor, or rather, the Manor was its anchor, its physical manifestation in this world. It was a parasite, ancient and insatiable, feeding on the very essence of human experience. It didn't just consume memories, it consumed the self. It stripped away the unique tapestry of a person's life, leaving behind an empty vessel, a husk. The old man wasn't just sick, he had been eaten. His mind was a blank slate, ready to be overwritten, ready to become something else, and that was its method. It didn't kill the body directly, and the manor with its labyrinthine passages and forgotten rooms was its larder, its hunting ground. It didn't want a quick meal, it wanted a slow, agonizing feast, savoring each forgotten moment, each lost emotion. My own mind felt like a sieve, leaking precious fragments of who I was. My name, Reed, felt solid, but the memories attached to it were fraying at the edges. My profession, antique restorer, was a fact, but the passion, the intricate knowledge, the feel of the wood under my fingers, it was all fading, dissolving into the pervasive hum. The entity didn't just want to live in the manor, it wanted to become everything within it. It wanted to absorb all identities, all memories, until it was the sole consciousness, a monstrous composite of stolen souls. And to truly appease it, to satisfy its ancient hunger, it demanded not just a life, but a complete willing surrender of self. A sacrifice of identity, the ultimate offering, to defeat it. I was not just trapped in the prison hospital ward at midnight. I was on the menu, and the feast had already begun. And the most terrifying realization was that it was here with me in this contained, oppressive space. My cot, a flimsy thing of metal and thin mattress, felt like a slab in a tomb. Each breath I took was shallow, tasting of antiseptic and something acrid, something like fear but not entirely my own. It wasn't just my attempts at physical escape that were being foiled. My very thoughts were under siege. Memories, once crisp and sharp, now frayed at the edges, dissolving into indistinct blurs. I try to grasp a specific detail, the curve of the manor's banister, the scent of aged wood polish, the face of a colleague, and it would slip through my mental fingers like sand. The entity wasn't just taking, it was erasing. It was turning my mind into a desolate landscape, brick by brick, leaving behind only patches of crumbling foundation. A desperate, burning ember in the ashes of my crumbling self. I understood its hunger now, its insidious feast. It thrived on what I was, on what I had been. My history, my identity, my very essence, these were its sustenance. And if it fed on memory, perhaps memory could also be its trap. I sat up on the cot, the thin blanket pooling around my waist. The ward was silent save for the distant, rhythmic clang of a pipe or the soft shuffle of a guard's boots far down the corridor. My head throbbed, a dull, insistent drumbeat behind my eyes. I pressed my palms against my temples, trying to coax order from the chaos. The manor. It all began in the manor. The hidden passages, the forgotten archives, the dust motes dancing in shafts of ancient light. I remembered the feeling of exhilaration when I first uncovered the concealed chamber, the thrill of discovery. It was a place of deep, resonant history, and I, Reed, had been drawn to it like a moth to a flame. I, Reed. The name felt alien on my tongue, a brittle shard of glass. Was I still Reed, or merely a collection of fading echoes, a flicker, a memory more stubborn than the rest? His obsession with containment, not just of physical structures, but of influence. The revelation hit me with the force of a physical blow, stealing my breath. The architect hadn't just built a house, he'd built a cage. A sophisticated trap designed to contain something formless, something that fed on the very fabric of being. And I, in my meticulous restoration, had unwittingly opened its door. My plan began to coalesce, terrifying in its simplicity, horrifying in its cost. If the entity consumed memory, if it thrived on identity, then I had to give it a feast it couldn't digest. A poisoned banquet. I needed to offer it something so vast, so overwhelming, that it would gorge itself into a stupor, or perhaps into an eternal, self-destructive loop. The key was the manor itself. The physical structure was imbued with layers of forgotten lives, countless fragmented memories from generations of inhabitants. It wasn't just stone and timber. It was a vast, sprawling repository of human experience, a colossal memory archive. My plan wasn't to destroy the entity, but to trap it within the manor's very foundations, using the weight of its own nourishment against it. But for the trap to work, for the entity to be fully drawn in and overwhelmed, it needed a final, irresistible lure. something to bind it, to anchor it to the Manor's memory core. And that something, I realized with a sickening lurch in my gut, had to be me. My own memories, my identity, every detail of my life, every learned skill, every cherished moment, every regret. I would have to willingly offer myself, not as a sacrifice to be consumed, but as a bait, a trigger. I would become the conduit, channeling the raw, untamed essence of my being into the Manor's heart, creating a vortex of pure, concentrated identity that would pull the entity into its ultimate prison. The cost would be everything. My mind, my sense of self, my very existence as Reed. I would become an empty vessel, a husk. Or perhaps worse, I would become one with the Manor, another layer of forgotten history, forever bound to its stone and dust. This was the only way. The only chance to stop it from spilling out into the world, to prevent it from devouring countless others. I glanced around the sterile, suffocating ward. The air still felt heavy, but now it was charged with a different kind of energy, the electric hum of a terrible, desperate resolve. The entity was here lurking, sensing my despair, my fear, but it also sensed my plan, and it would fight me. The challenge wasn't just to execute the plan, but to retain enough of myself to do so. To hold onto the threads of Reed, the restorer, the man who understood structure and decay, just long enough to seal the ultimate restoration. It was a race against time, against the relentless erosion of my own being. The guard, if he passed by, would see a man slumped on his cot, lost in thought. But inside, I was already dismantling myself, preparing the ultimate offering. I was a craftsman after all, and this, I realized, would be my final, most meticulous, most terrifying restoration, the restoration of oblivion. I visualized its intricate layout, the hidden mechanisms, the very feel of its aged walls. I had to get back there. I had to convince them. The guards, the attendant, they wouldn't understand. They would see a madman, but I wasn't mad. I was desperate. And I was determined to offer up my sanity piece by piece as the ultimate weapon. A faint, sickly sweet scent drifted on the sterile air, a smell I now associated with the entity, a blend of dust, decay, and something indescribably ancient like forgotten incense. It was a warning, a challenge. It knew I was planning. It was already trying to unravel my resolve, to make me forget the purpose of this terrible sacrifice. But I would not break, not yet. I would hold on to the name Reed until the very end. The sterile air of the prison hospital ward at midnight was no longer just sterile. The heavy door, once merely locked, now seemed to pulse with a low, malevolent thrum. The single, barred window showed not the moon, but a swirling vortex of indistinct gray, like smoke struggling to remember its form. This wasn't a ward. This was the entity's final chamber, a manufactured reality designed to strip me bare. I pressed my back against the rough, cold concrete wall, the coarse texture digging into my skin, a welcome anchor. My name was Reed. I was an antique restorer. I knew the weight of a century-old lacquer brush in my hand, the faint scent of aged wood, the delicate give of a worn tapestry. These were truths, not delusions. This was my plan. To reconstruct myself, piece by painful piece, like I would a shattered Ming vase. Reed, who is Reed? A name, a fleeting sound. A jolt went through me. I closed my eyes, forcing my mind past the flickering fluorescent lights and the metallic tang of fear in the air. I reached for the earliest, clearest memory, the small, sun-drenched workshop of my mentor, the scent of linseed oil and sawdust. The first time I held a fragment of a broken clock face, its delicate enamel chipped, and felt the surge of understanding, the quiet confidence that I could make it whole again. It was a simple, pure moment of self-discovery. The ward shuddered. Your mentor, he never existed. Your hands are empty. You have never created, only destroyed. My hands, I looked at them. They were pale, trembling. They felt alien, clumsy. I clenched them into fists, nails digging into palms. No, my hands knew. They remembered the delicate curve of a chisel, the patient stroke of fine-grit sandpaper. I focused on the intricate grain of a forgotten mahogany desk, the subtle repairs I'd made, invisible to the untrained eye. My craft was meticulousness. It was patience. It was truth. The air grew frigid. The thin blanket on the cot beside me began to fray at an impossible speed, threads unraveling into nothingness like my own memories being pulled apart. A sense of overwhelming failure washed over me. The entity was showing me the ruin, the decay, the things I couldn't fix. It was twisting my purpose against me. You restore. You only hasten the end. Look at the manor. Look at yourself. You are broken beyond repair. A wave of nausea hit me. I staggered, my head spinning. The ward's walls rippled, the concrete dissolving into patches of peeling wallpaper from the manor, then reforming into cracked plaster. The smell of antiseptic gave way to the musty odor of ancient dust and decay, thick and suffocating. This was the entity's attempt to drown me in the manor's reality, to consume my identity within its own, vast, decaying self. I fought it. I pictured the intricate joinery of a Queen Anne chair, the way each piece fit perfectly, designed to hold. My mind became a workshop. I didn't just remember restoring, I was restoring. I mentally cleaned the grime from the memory of the chair, re-glued its loose joints, polished its surface until it gleamed. It was a conscious act of defiance, a mental reconstruction of my own identity, using the very tools and principles that defined me. The entity shrieked, a sound that wasn't sound but a vibration through my bones, shaking the foundations of my sanity. The prison hospital ward fractured. I was no longer just standing, I was pinned, unable to move, gravity itself a crushing weight. You are nothing, a fleeting thought, a wisp of smoke. I am eternal, I am the forgotten, the unmade, you are mine. My lungs burned, my vision blurred. It was trying to erase my name, my face, the very concept of Reed. But I wouldn't let it. I focused on a single, indelible detail, the tiny, almost imperceptible scratch on the bottom of my favorite magnifying glass, a scratch I'd made myself years ago. It was a mark of my own imperfect, tangible existence. It was real. It was mine. And then I spoke. Not aloud, for my throat was seized, but with every fiber of my being I projected the words into the maelstrom of the entity's consciousness. I am Reed. I mend what is broken. I bring light to the forgotten. You feed on decay, but I find beauty in the fractured. You are ancient, but I am now, and I will not be unmade. The pressure intensified, but something in me held. The magnifying glass, that tiny scratch, became a beacon. I held onto it, a fragment of myself, polishing it in my mind until it shone with a fierce, unwavering light. I saw the entity recoil, its formless presence momentarily shriveling under the assertion of my singular, defined existence. It could corrupt memories, yes, but it couldn't destroy the act of remembering, the will to be. The prison hospital ward, or what was left of it, convulsed. The gray vortex outside the window shattered, not into glass, but into 1,000 fragments of distorted reality. The cold stone slab dissolved. I found myself kneeling on the dusty, rotting floorboards of the manor's grand hall, the air thick with the scent of mildew and damp earth, but also faintly the sharp tang of my own fear and something else, a fragile, nascent clarity. But it had retreated. The ultimate delusion had broken. I was back in the physical space, battered, exhausted, but I was Reed. I had fought for myself, and for now I had won. I had merely pushed it back, and the cost of this skirmish for my own mind was a profound, aching weariness, a sense that a part of me, however small, had indeed been worn away in the struggle.